The rain fell in heavy sheets across the Golden Gate Bridge as Jessica Morgan's Porsche hydroplaned toward the edge. Her knuckles white against the steering wheel, her scream lost in the storm. Then, from nowhere, a small figure on a battered motorcycle. Mike Reynolds didn't hesitate, he just acted. Neither knew this moment would change everything. Mike Reynolds stirred the pancake batter with practiced precision, his weathered hands moving on autopilot while his mind ran through the day ahead. The small Oakland apartment filled with morning light as he glanced at the clock. 6:15. "Emma, sweetheart. Almost ready," he called out, his voice carrying down the short hallway to his daughter's bedroom. At 42, Mike's compact frame had begun to show the years of physical labor. His face, kind but tired, bore the lines of someone who had weathered more storms than most. 2 years after losing his wife Sarah to cancer, he had settled into the grueling rhythm of single parenthood, a delicate balancing act of before-school breakfasts, after-work homework sessions, and the constant, gnawing worry about whether he was doing enough. The pancakes sizzled as they hit the pan, and Mike allowed himself a small smile. At least he could still make her favorite breakfast. "Coming, Dad." Emma's voice preceded her appearance. At 9 years old, she was all gangly limbs and boundless energy, her dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail that she'd attempted to style herself. She wore her favorite shirt, the one with planets and stars that Sarah had given her for her last birthday before she passed. Mike felt the familiar pang in his chest but pushed it aside. "Did you pack your science project?" he asked. Sliding a perfectly golden pancake onto her plate, Emma nodded enthusiastically, her mouth already full of breakfast. "Miss Harris says mine might win first place." Her pride was infectious, and Mike ruffled her hair affectionately. "Of course it will. You're the smartest kid in that school." What he didn't say was how he'd stayed up until midnight helping her finish it, after working a 12-hour shift as a security guard at Morgan Innovations, the same company where he'd once hoped to work as an engineer before his previous employer went bankrupt, and the only position available had been in security. Across the bay in Pacific Heights, Jessica Morgan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse, coffee in hand, gazing at the San Francisco skyline. At 38, she had achieved what most could only dream of: CEO of Morgan Innovations, the tech company her father had founded, and that she had transformed into a global powerhouse under her leadership. Her tailored navy suit emphasized her slender frame, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek chignon that highlighted her striking features. To the world, she projected an image of effortless perfection, but the truth was more complicated. The penthouse, with its minimalist design and museum-quality art, felt more like a hotel than a home. She checked her watch. 6:30. The executive meeting was at 8, which gave her ample time to review the quarterly projections before her driver arrived. Jessica sipped her coffee and scrolled through her emails, efficiently categorizing and responding. The self-driving car navigation system, her father's final project, before his unexpected death 3 years ago, was behind schedule. The engineering team couldn't solve a critical calibration issue, and the board was growing impatient. Her jaw clenched involuntarily. She'd promised to complete her father's vision, and failure wasn't an option. In the silence of her perfect apartment, Jessica acknowledged a truth she rarely admitted even to herself: she was lonely. Relationships had always taken a back seat to her career, and now at the pinnacle of success, she found herself surrounded by people who wanted something from her, but no one who simply wanted her. With a sigh, she set down her coffee cup and headed for the shower. Sentimentality was a luxury she couldn't afford today. The security checkpoint at Morgan Innovations was busy with the morning rush when Mike badged in, nodding politely to his supervisor, Frank. "Morning," he mumbled, slipping into the small break room to change into his uniform. The navy blue outfit with security emblazoned across the back was a daily reminder of how far he'd fallen professionally. 5 years ago, he had been a promising mechanical engineer specializing in vehicle safety systems. Now, he watched engineers and executives stride past him as if he were invisible. He checked his phone. A text from Emma's babysitter confirming she'd pick her up from school. He texted back a quick thanks, relieved that at least that part of his day was sorted. His shift had barely begun when the call came through on his radio: there was a spill on the 14th floor, and maintenance needed access to the supply closet. Mike sighed and headed for the elevator. Another day, another mess to help clean up. Jessica strode through the sleek lobby of Morgan Innovations headquarters, her heels clicking authoritatively on the polished floor. Employees parted before her like water around a stone, nodding deferentially or murmuring, "Good morning, Miss Morgan." She acknowledged them with brief nods, her mind already in the boardroom. The elevator was being held for her, a courtesy no one had to be told to extend. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of a security guard in the corner of the lobby. There was something vaguely familiar about him, but she dismissed the thought. The executive floor was buzzing with activity when she arrived, her assistant Bradley immediately at her side with a tablet. "The board members are all here, and I've ordered lunch from Miro as requested," he said, falling into step beside her. "And Tim Reynolds wants a moment before the meeting begins." Jessica nodded. Tim was her head of engineering, brilliant but prickly, and lately, increasingly defensive about the navigation system delays. The boardroom fell silent as Jessica entered, 12 pairs of eyes tracking her progress to the head of the table. "Good morning," she said crisply, setting down her portfolio. "Let's begin with the navigation system update." "Tim?" Tim Reynolds, a tall man with prematurely graying hair and permanent worry lines, stood up and dimmed the lights for his presentation. "We're making progress," he began, but the tension in his voice suggested otherwise. For the next 30 minutes, Jessica listened as Tim outlined the technical challenges, the attempted solutions, and the continued failures. The calibration issue was proving more stubborn than anticipated, and each failed test pushed the launch date further back. The board members' expressions grew increasingly skeptical, and Jessica felt a headache building behind her eyes. This project wasn't just about business, it was her father's legacy, and she had promised him on his deathbed that she would see it through. When Tim finished, the questions began, pointed and increasingly impatient. Jessica intervened before the situation deteriorated further. "We'll solve this," she said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I'll personally oversee the engineering team's efforts moving forward." The meeting continued, but the damage was done. The board's confidence was shaken, and Jessica knew her promise had a time limit. Mike's day was a blur of routine tasks, checking badges, monitoring security cameras, patrolling the building's perimeter. During his lunch break, he sat alone in the staff cafeteria, eating a sandwich he'd packed from home while flipping through a technical journal he'd borrowed from the company library. Old habits died hard, and he still tried to keep up with developments in his field, even if no one recognized his expertise anymore. He was deep in an article about sensor calibration when a group of engineers from the 14th floor sat down at the table next to him. Normally, they wouldn't have registered his presence, but today they were too engrossed in their conversation to notice him at all. "Reynolds is losing it," one of them said, voice low but clear enough for Mike to hear. "The calibration issue is killing us, and he's blaming everyone but himself." Another engineer snorted. "You know who's really going to lose it? Morgan. This was her father's baby, and now it's crashing and burning." Mike frowned, his interest piqued despite himself. He'd heard rumors about problems with the self-driving navigation system but hadn't realized how serious they were. As the engineers continued their conversation, Mike couldn't help but listen more intently. He'd worked on similar systems before, and something about their description of the problem nagged at him, a familiar puzzle he couldn't quite place. 2 weeks later, Emma woke with a fever, her small face flushed and eyes glassy. Mike called her school, then reluctantly phoned Frank. "My daughter's sick," he explained, already anticipating the response. Frank's sigh was audible even through the phone. "Reynolds, we're short-staffed already. Can't your babysitter take her?" Mike's jaw tightened. "She's at her other job." "I'll find someone, but I might be late." The truth was, there was no one else. Sarah's parents lived in Arizona, and his own family was scattered across the country. Frank's grudging fine, but not later than 10 was the best he could hope for. After giving Emma some children's fever reducer and packing a bag with books, her tablet, and a change of clothes, Mike helped her into the passenger seat of his aging Honda. "We're going to my work today, sweetheart," he explained, trying to sound upbeat. "Just for a little while until you feel better." Emma nodded weakly, still drowsy from the medication. Mike's stomach churned with worry and guilt. A sick child didn't belong at a corporate office building, but he couldn't afford to lose this job. Morgan Innovations was already bustling when they arrived. Mike parked in his usual spot, far from the executive lot with its luxury vehicles. "Stay close to me," he instructed Emma as they walked through the employee entrance. He'd planned to set her up in the security break room, but Frank intercepted them in the lobby, his expression making it clear that a sick child was an unwelcome complication. "She can't stay down here," Frank hissed. "Take her to the 14th floor break room, it's quieter, and no one uses it before lunch." Mike nodded gratefully, and led Emma to the elevator, hoping they could slip in and out without drawing attention. But luck wasn't on their side. Just as the doors were about to close, a manicured hand shot between them, and the doors slid open to reveal Jessica Morgan herself, immaculate in a charcoal suit, her expression suggesting she was already categorizing this delay as an annoyance in her meticulously scheduled day. Jessica stepped into the elevator, her eyes briefly registering the security guard and the small, clearly unwell child beside him. A flicker of irritation crossed her face. Company policy discouraged employees from bringing children to work, especially to the executive and research floors. She was about to say something when she met the little girl's eyes, large, brown, and feverish, but with an intelligence that gave her pause. The child offered a weak smile, and Jessica found herself nodding curtly, instead of objecting. The security guard, his badge read, Reynolds, looked tense, as if expecting a reprimand. The elevator began its ascent in uncomfortable silence. Jessica stared straight ahead, but her peripheral vision caught the gentle way Reynolds adjusted the child's sweater, tucking it more securely around her shoulders. There was something in the gesture that stirred a distant memory, her own father, years ago, doing the same for her during a childhood illness. The thought was unwelcome, a crack in her carefully maintained professional veneer. When the elevator reached the 14th floor, Reynolds ushered the child out with a murmured, "Excuse us, Miss Morgan." Jessica merely nodded, but as the doors closed between them, she found herself wondering about the story behind those two mismatched figures heading down the hallway. Mike settled Emma in the break room with her books and tablet, making her promise to stay put while he completed his morning rounds. The floor was relatively quiet, with most of the engineers sequestered in the main lab working on the navigation system problem. He completed his security check quickly, and returned to find Emma drowsing on the break room couch. Her fever seemed to have broken, but he still placed a cool hand on her forehead every few minutes, worry gnawing at him. Around 11, voices from the adjacent conference room grew louder, frustration evident even through the wall. "It's the same damn problem." Someone shouted. Tim Reynolds, Mike recognized. "The sensors are calibrating correctly in the lab, but failing in real-world conditions." Another voice responded more calmly, but with equal frustration. "We've tried every combination in the book, Tim. Maybe we need to rethink the entire approach." Mike found himself listening intently despite himself. The calibration problem sounded familiar, reminiscent of an issue his old team had tackled years ago with a different system. Almost unconsciously, he began sketching on a napkin, working through the problem as he understood it based on the fragments of conversation from next door. The meeting in the conference room broke up around noon, the engineers filing out with defeated expressions. Mike quickly tucked his napkin into his pocket and checked on Emma, who was now absorbed in a game on her tablet, her color much improved. He relaxed slightly, maybe they could make it through the day, without incident after all. But as the engineers dispersed for lunch, one of them left the conference room door open, revealing the whiteboard covered in diagrams and equations. Mike's eyes were drawn to it automatically, his engineer's mind engaging before he could stop himself. He recognized the calibration issue immediately. It was indeed similar to a problem he'd helped solve years ago. The solution wasn't complex, but it required thinking outside conventional parameters. Without really thinking about what he was doing, Mike stepped into the empty conference room, picked up a marker, and began writing in a corner of the whiteboard just a small notation, a suggested alternative approach that might lead them out of their recursive loop of failure. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The sharp voice made Mike freeze, marker still in hand. Tim Reynolds stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. I just thought." Mike began, but Tim cut him off. "You're security, not engineering. This is classified project material." He strode forward, erasing Mike's notation with aggressive swipes. "I don't know what you think you know, but stick to watching cameras and checking badges." The humiliation burned through Mike as he retreated from the room, acutely aware of the curious stares from engineers returning from lunch. "Sorry," he mumbled, hurrying back to the break room where Emma waited, oblivious to her father's mortification. The rest of the day passed in a blur of shame and regret. Mike should have known better. He wasn't an engineer anymore, and his input wasn't welcome, no matter how relevant it might be. By the time his shift ended, Emma's fever had returned, and all he wanted was to get her home to bed and put this disastrous day behind them. Jessica was working late again, the building gradually emptying around her as the day staff departed and the night security took over. Her meeting with the board had gone poorly, their patience with the navigation system delays visibly wearing thin. The implied threat was clear: solve this problem, or we'll find someone who can. She rubbed her temples, fighting off a tension headache. A movement in the hallway caught her attention, the security guard from the elevator, Reynolds, walking past with his now sleeping daughter in his arms. Something about the image struck her: the careful way he cradled the child, his obvious exhaustion, yet the tenderness with which he carried his burden. Jessica found herself standing, moving to her office door. Is she all right? The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Reynolds, who paused, shifting the sleeping child slightly. Her fever came back, he said quietly. I'm taking her home now. Jessica nodded, suddenly awkward. This wasn't the kind of conversation she typically had with employees, particularly not security personnel. I hope she feels better soon, she offered, the words feeling stiff and formal on her tongue. Reynolds gave her a tired smile that transformed his face, momentarily revealing the man beneath the uniform. "Thank you, Miss Morgan." Then he was gone, leaving Jessica with the strange sensation that she'd glimpsed something real and valuable in a day otherwise filled with pretense and disappointment. Over the next few weeks, the navigation system problems continued to plague the engineering team. Jessica found herself spending more time on the 14th floor, her presence both motivating and intimidating the engineers. During one such visit, she passed the break room and paused, hearing a child's voice, excitedly explaining something. Curiosity drew her closer. Through the partially open door, she saw Reynolds off duty, in civilian clothes sitting with his daughter, who appeared fully recovered. Between them on the table was what looked like a homemade model of a car with various small components scattered around it. "So, the sensors have to talk to each other," Emma, Reynolds was explaining, his voice patient and clear. "Like how you talk to your friends at school. But imagine if you were all speaking different languages, you wouldn't understand each other, right?" The girl nodded solemnly. "That's what's happening with the navigation system. The sensors are getting confused because they're getting different information from the real world than they expect." Jessica found herself lingering, surprised by the accurate and simplified explanation of exactly the problem her team was struggling with. More surprising was the easy authority in Reynolds' voice, not the tentative tone of a security guard discussing technical matters beyond his expertise, but the confidence of someone who knew precisely what he was talking about. Before she could process this revelation, her phone buzzed with a message from Bradley about an urgent call. Jessica slipped away, but the image of Reynolds explaining complex engineering concepts to his daughter stayed with her. That evening, she found herself searching the company database for his personnel file. Michael Reynolds, 42, hired 3 years ago as a security guard. But his employment history caught her eye previously, a mechanical engineer at Westlake Automotive, specializing in sensor systems for vehicle safety features, until the company filed for bankruptcy 5 years ago. Jessica sat back in her chair, pieces falling into place. Not just a security guard, then, but an engineer working in security because life had dealt him an unexpected hand. She wondered briefly if Tim Reynolds knew about Mike's background, and if he did, whether professional pride had prevented him from considering input from someone now deemed beneath his station. Jessica closed the file, troubled by the implications. How many other valuable perspectives were being ignored due to hierarchy and assumption? And what might it cost her company and her father's legacy in the end? Rain lashed against the windshield as Jessica drove across the Golden Gate Bridge, her Porsche hugging the curves of the road. It was nearly midnight, and she was exhausted after another long day of meetings and disappointments. The navigation system project was now officially behind schedule, and the board was making noise about bringing in outside consultants, a public admission of failure she wasn't prepared to make. The rain intensified, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of her car. Jessica slowed, hands tight on the wheel, her usual confidence behind the wheel shaken by the ferocity of the storm. A truck passed too closely, sending a wave of water across her windshield. For a critical second, she was completely blind. When her vision cleared, she realized with horror that she had drifted too far right. She jerked the wheel left, but the Porsche hydroplaned on the slick surface. Time seemed to slow as the car spun, tires finding no purchase on the wet road. The guardrail loomed, then impact a sickening crunch of metal on metal. The Porsche teetered precariously, half on the bridge, half suspended over the dark water below. Jessica sat frozen, the engine still running, afraid that any movement might send the car plummeting into the bay. Mike was heading home on his motorcycle, rain gear doing little to keep him dry in the deluge. His shift had ended at 11, and all he wanted was to get home to Emma and the babysitter who had graciously agreed to stay late. The traffic on the bridge was light due to the storm, most sensible people having sought shelter hours ago. Through the curtain of rain, his headlight illuminated something wrong ahead, a car at an impossible angle, half over the guardrail. Without hesitation, Mike pulled over, heart racing. The car was a Porsche, its sleek lines now crumpled against the barrier, its position perilous. As he approached, he saw the driver, a woman, alone, clearly terrified. With a jolt of recognition, he realized it was Jessica Morgan. There was no time to process this coincidence. The car shifted slightly, metal groaning against the strain. Any moment, it could slip over the edge. "Miss Morgan!" he shouted over the howling wind and rain. "Don't move." Her wide eyes found his, recognition and relief washing over her face. Mike assessed the situation rapidly. The driver's side door was against the guardrail, she couldn't exit that way. The passenger door hung over open space. The rear of the car was their only hope. "I'm going to break the back window," he called to her. "When I do, I need you to climb into the back seat," very slowly. Jessica nodded, terror making it impossible to speak. The security guard Reynolds had appeared like an apparition in the storm, and now he was her only hope of survival. She watched in the rearview mirror as he retrieved something from his motorcycle, then returned to the car. On the count of 3, I'm breaking the glass, he shouted. 1, 2, 3. The sound of shattering glass was almost lost in the storm. Reynolds cleared the frame quickly, then reached in. Give me your hand. Jessica unbuckled her seatbelt with trembling fingers, then began to maneuver between the front seats toward the back. The car groaned ominously, shifting further toward the edge. Hurry, Reynolds urged, his face taut with concentration. Jessica lunged forward, grabbing his outstretched hand. His grip was strong, sure, as he pulled her through the broken window. They fell backward onto the wet pavement just as the Porsche gave a final metallic scream and plunged over the edge, disappearing into the darkness below. For a moment, they lay there on the roadway, rain pelting them, the sound of the car hitting the water far below barely audible over the storm. Reynolds helped her to her feet, his hands steady on her shoulders. Are you hurt? He asked, eyes scanning her for injuries. Jessica shook her head, unable to form words, the reality of what had just happened, and what had nearly happened crashing over her like the waves below. Mike guided Jessica to the relative shelter of his parked motorcycle, keeping a supportive arm around her shoulders. She was in shock, her designer suit soaked and ruined, her usually perfect hair plastered to her face. We need to call the police, he said, pulling out his phone. Jessica nodded mutely, still processing her brush with death. While they waited for emergency services, Mike draped his spare rain jacket over her shoulders, concern evident in his eyes. Just breathe, he advised gently. You're safe now. When the police and ambulance arrived, Jessica refused transport to the hospital, insisting she was physically unharmed. The officers took statements, documented the accident, and arranged for cleanup of the debris. Throughout it all, Mike remained at her side, a steady presence in the chaos. Only when everything was settled did he prepare to leave. My daughter's waiting, he explained. Will you be all right? Jessica nodded, finally finding her voice. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. I don't know how to. Mike shook his head, cutting off her thanks. Anyone would have done the same, he said simply, though they both knew that wasn't true. Then, before she could say anything more, he was back on his motorcycle, disappearing into the rainy night, leaving Jessica standing beneath a police officer's umbrella, watching the taillights fade into the distance. The next morning, Jessica arrived at Morgan Innovations earlier than usual, having barely slept. The events on the bridge played on repeat in her mind, the terrifying moments suspended between life and death, and the unexpected rescuer who had appeared just when all seemed lost. Her first priority was finding Mike Reynolds. A check of the security roster told her he was scheduled for the day shift, starting at 8. Jessica instructed Bradley to have Reynolds sent to her office as soon as he arrived, ignoring her assistant's curious expression at the unusual request. When Mike knocked on her door precisely at 8:15, Jessica was struck by how different he looked in his uniform, the anonymous security guard once again, not the man who had pulled her from certain death with such calm authority. Please, sit down, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Mike complied, his posture stiff, expression guarded. Miss Morgan, if this is about last night, Jessica interrupted him. Why did you leave? The question had been bothering her all night. The police wanted to interview you as a witness, and I didn't get to properly thank you. Mike shifted uncomfortably in the chair. My daughter was waiting, and He hesitated. I didn't want to make a scene. Jessica studied him, trying to reconcile this modest man with the hero from the bridge. You saved my life, she said simply. That deserves more than a hurried thank you in the rain. Mike's expression softened slightly. I'm just glad I was there. A silence fell between them, pregnant with unasked questions. Finally, Jessica spoke again. Your personnel file says you were an engineer before joining our security team. Mike tensed visibly, perhaps expecting criticism for his unauthorized input on the whiteboard weeks earlier. Instead, Jessica continued. I saw you explaining sensor calibration to your daughter in the break room. You understand our navigation system problem, don't you? The question hung in the air between them. Mike hesitated, then nodded slowly. I worked on similar issues at Westlake before they went under. The problem your team is having. I think I might know an approach they haven't tried. Jessica leaned forward, her business instincts overriding everything else. Tell me. For the next hour, Mike explained his thoughts on the calibration issue, growing more animated as he spoke. Jessica listened intently, occasionally asking precise, insightful questions that revealed her own deep technical knowledge. It was the most engaged conversation either of them had had in months, perhaps years, two minds connecting over a shared puzzle, professional barriers temporarily forgotten. When Mike finished, Jessica sat back in her chair, a new respect in her eyes. "Why didn't you speak up sooner?" Mike's expression clouded. "I tried, once. It didn't go well." Understanding dawned on Jessica's face. "Tim Reynolds." Mike nodded but offered no further comment. His loyalty as an employee evident even in his restraint. Jessica made a decision. "I'd like you to join the engineering team meetings on this project," she said. "As a consultant, not security." Mike's surprise was evident. "Miss Morgan, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure the team would." Jessica cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Let me worry about the team. What I want to know is if you're willing to try." Mike was silent for a long moment, weighing his answer. "I have a condition," he finally said. "My daughter comes first. I need flexible hours to take care of her." Jessica studied him, impressed by his priorities despite the professional opportunity being offered. "Done," she said simply. "We start today." The engineering team's reaction to Mike's presence in their meeting was predictably frosty, particularly from Tim Reynolds, whose thinly veiled disdain was apparent in every interaction. Jessica had introduced Mike as a special consultant without elaborating on his current role at the company, but word had quickly spread. As Mike began outlining his approach to the calibration problem, the skepticism in the room was palpable. "With all due respect," Tim interrupted, his tone suggesting respect was the last thing on his mind, "we've been working on this problem for months. What makes you think you can solve it when an entire team of qualified engineers cannot?" The challenge hung in the air. Mike met Tim's gaze steadily. "Because you're looking at it as a software problem," he said quietly. "But it's not. It's an environmental interpretation issue." He turned to the whiteboard and began drawing a simple diagram. "The sensors are working perfectly in the lab because the conditions are controlled. But in the real world, they're getting confused by variable inputs. You need to create a translation layer, a buffer that helps the system recognize and filter environmental anomalies." The room was silent, as Mike continued his explanation, his natural teaching ability, making complex concepts accessible. By the time he finished, even the most skeptical engineers were exchanging thoughtful glances. "It could work," one of them admitted grudgingly. "It's worth testing, at least." Over the next 2 weeks, Mike divided his time between his security duties and the engineering lab, where his approach was methodically implemented and tested. The initial results were promising. The calibration issues decreased significantly under the new framework. Jessica made a point of stopping by the lab each day, ostensibly to check on progress, but increasingly to observe Mike in his element. She was struck by the transformation. The quiet security guard had become an authoritative presence among the engineers, his expertise earning reluctant but growing respect. More intriguing were the glimpses of his relationship with his daughter, who occasionally visited the lab after school. Emma was clearly adored by her father, and his patient explanations of his work to her revealed both his natural teaching ability and her precocious intelligence. One afternoon, Jessica arrived to find Emma perched on a stool, watching intently as Mike demonstrated a sensor component. "So it's like having really good eyes and ears," the girl was saying. "The car needs to see and hear the world correctly." Mike nodded, pleased with her understanding. "Exactly. And our job is to make sure it understands what it sees and hears." The scene stirred something unexpected in Jessica, a wistful recognition of the bond between parent and child that she had once shared with her own father, and a sense of absence in her current life that she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon. The latest test results showed a 97% success rate in real-world conditions, well above the threshold needed for commercial viability. The engineering team, including Tim Reynolds, gathered around the monitors as the data streamed in. "It works," Tim said, disbelief evident in his voice. "It actually works." Mike stood quietly at the back of the group, a small smile the only indication of his satisfaction. Jessica, who had been in a board meeting, arrived as the celebration was beginning. She took in the scene, the jubilant engineers, the successful test results on the screens, and Mike, characteristically understated in his moment of vindication. Their eyes met across the room, a current of shared understanding passing between them. Later, after the team dispersed, Jessica found Mike gathering his things to leave. "You did it," she said simply. Mike shook his head. "The team did it. I just pointed them in a different direction." Jessica studied him, struck again by his lack of ego in an industry where self-promotion was the norm. "The board wants to meet tomorrow," she said. "I'd like you to present the solution." Mike hesitated. "Emma has a school play tomorrow afternoon. I promised I'd be there." Jessica found herself smiling. Then we'll schedule the board meeting in the morning. Emma's play is important. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 the next morning. Mike arrived early, uncharacteristically nervous in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit his compact frame. Jessica met him in the hallway outside the boardroom, her own designer suit a stark contrast to his attire. "Ready?" she asked. Mike nodded, adjusting his tie self-consciously. "As I'll ever be." Jessica surprised them both by reaching out to straighten his tie herself, the gesture unusually personal. "Just explain it the way you did to Emma," she advised. "They may be board members, but they're not as smart as your daughter." The joke broke the tension, and Mike's grateful smile transformed his face. Inside the boardroom, the board members regarded Mike with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. Jessica introduced him simply, "This is Mike Reynolds, the engineer who solved our calibration problem." For the next 20 minutes, Mike explained his solution in clear, accessible terms, without the technical jargon that often characterized such presentations. He used everyday analogies to illustrate complex concepts, his natural teaching ability evident in every explanation. By the time he finished, the board's skepticism had transformed into impressed appreciation. "Outstanding work, Mr. Reynolds," the chairman said. "Miss Morgan, I think we found our new head of safety systems engineering." Jessica smiled diplomatically. "Mr. Reynolds has certainly earned a position on our engineering team," she agreed, "though we'll need to discuss the details." After the meeting concluded, Jessica and Mike walked together toward the elevator. "That went well," she observed. Mike nodded, relief evident in his posture. "Better than I expected." Jessica hesitated, then added, "The chairman was right. We need someone to head the safety systems division. The position is yours, if you want it." Mike stopped walking, surprise clear on his face. "Miss Morgan." "Jessica." "I don't know what to say." Jessica faced him directly. "Say yes. The salary is triple what you make in security, and the hours are flexible. You can be there for Emma, and still do the work you were trained for." Mike's expression was a complex mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "I'd need to think about it," he said finally. "It's a big change." Jessica nodded, understanding. "Of course. But don't think too long. We need you, Mike." As she walked away, Jessica was struck by the realization that she meant those words more personally than she had intended. That afternoon, Jessica found herself doing something she had never done before, leaving work early to attend an elementary school play. She slipped into the back of the auditorium just as the performance was beginning, feeling oddly self-conscious in her business attire among the casually dressed parents. She spotted Mike in the third row, his attention fixed on the stage where Emma, dressed as a planet, was delivering her lines with endearing seriousness. Jessica watched Mike more than the play, struck by the pride and love evident in his expression. When the performance ended, she hung back as parents congratulated their children, feeling suddenly like an intruder in this warm, unfamiliar world. She was about to slip away when Emma spotted her. "Miss Morgan," the girl called out, running over with unexpected enthusiasm. "You came to see my play." Mike followed his daughter, surprise evident on his face. "Jessica," he acknowledged, using her first name naturally now. "I didn't expect to see you here." Jessica felt uncharacteristically flustered. "I wanted to see what was important enough to schedule around a board meeting," she said, attempting a lightness she didn't quite feel. Emma beamed up at her. "I was Saturn. Did you see my rings?" Jessica found herself smiling genuinely at the child's excitement. "You were the best planet in the solar system," she assured her, earning a delighted giggle. "We're going for ice cream to celebrate," Mike explained. "Would you like to join us?" The invitation caught Jessica off guard. Her evening plans consisted of takeout and budget reports the same as most nights. "I wouldn't want to intrude on your celebration," she demurred. Emma looked up at her with those earnest brown eyes. "Please come. Dad says celebrations are better when you share them with people." Something in the simple wisdom of the child's words struck Jessica deeply. When was the last time she had celebrated anything, let alone shared a celebration? "I'd love to," she heard herself say, surprising all three of them.